I'm Alex Tock. I'm the director of the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership. I want to welcome you all here tonight and thank you for coming, especially if you're in person and made it through the weather here, thank you. If you're still at home watching us remotely, I certainly understand wanting to stay safe tonight. So the Thompson Center is really delighted to be able to sponsor today's event and bring Congressman Lipinski here to Madison. I want to thank our staff, Ruth and Mary Kate, for doing all of the work to make this possible, as well as our speaker for driving up here despite the weather tonight. For those of you unfamiliar with the Thompson Center, let me say just a few brief words. The Thompson Center was founded to follow in the footsteps of Governor Thompson, who proudly worked with both sides of the aisle to advance the public good. The Thompson Center seeks to carry on Governor Thompson's legacy by informing and inspiring current and future public leaders, fostering leadership skills, and advancing effective public policy. We work to further these goals by holding public events, funding research and scholarship, and conducting other activities throughout the UW system. And for more information on our future events and other activities, please visit our website. Today, I have the honor of introducing Dan Lipinski, Ph.D. Dan was born and raised in Chicago, received his bachelor's degree from Northwestern and his master's from Stanford in engineering, before receiving his doctorate in political science from Duke. He was a professor at the University of Notre Dame and then at the University of Tennessee, where he wrote Congressional Communication, Content and Consequences with University of Michigan Press, as well as several academic articles and book chapters on the legislative process. From there, he was elected to Congress from Illinois' 3rd District in 2004, where he served from 2004 until 2005, to 2021. He's the author of 20 laws while in Congress on a wide range of issues, and served on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where he chaired the subcommittee on rail, pipelines, and hazardous material, and on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, where he chaired and served as ranking member of the Research and Technology Subcommittee for a decade. Oh, missing a page here. So he has since retired after losing the 2000 Democratic primary, and has recently become a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution, I think that's right. As well as is it Lipinski Consulting? You have a LLC, and has written articles for numerous publications, including First Things, The Atlantic, and op-eds for the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune. So Congressman Lipinski, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Before we start, though, and I don't want to,
please.
It's not to give you trouble,
Yeah.
but it's just, I always have to make sure my employers are all mentioned. So I'm a fellow at the University of Dallas also.
I knew I was leaving one thing out.
So
I have a page
I'm
of my
the
notes.
Pope Leo XIII Fellow on Social Thought at University of Dallas. So I want to make sure that they hear that. Go ahead.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about
Yes.
that.
No, please. I meant to include that. So I really want to talk about, I think, three subjects that have been on my mind, as well as opening it up to questions. Those are dealing with polarization and faith in politics, as well as what us academics get wrong about Congress, since you've been on both sides. But I want to start with just giving you a chance to introduce yourself, and if I've left anything out, or you want to say what you've been working on and thinking about recently.
I wasn't that bio long enough? I want to thank you, Alex and Ruth, the Tommy Thompson Center, for bringing me here today. I very much appreciate it. You couldn't do anything about the snow, so I made it safely, so everything's good. But I appreciate very much the mission of the Tommy Thompson Center. I really think that our republic is in trouble. I think that a lot of what I've been writing about and speaking about over the last couple of years is how the nature of partisanship, I believe, has changed. It is sectarian. We have sectarian partisanship that a lot of people sort of buy into. It's become a fundamentalist pseudo-religion for many people, where they feel like, well, I've got two sides to choose from. Once I choose a side, and I have to choose one, we sort of get that message, then I have to subscribe to everything, every policy position, even vision of what human nature is, all these things, and I can't step out of line, or else I'm going to get, I'm a heretic. I'm going to get excommunicated. I'm going to get pushed out. I read this in a Science magazine piece. Is about a dozen social scientists. Barry, you weren't part of that, were you? And they said this fits the definition of sectarianism. And I said, in their description, everything, I was like, they're exactly right. That's what we have. And with sectarianism, sectarian partisanship, everything becomes a zero-sum game. And that doesn't work in a democracy, especially a very diverse democracy like this. The country was set up, the Constitution was written to force debate, deliberation, and compromise. And so especially in the American system, these parties make the system dysfunctional at best. The House of Representatives has made itself irrelevant for the last 15 years on almost every big issue. Almost every single major law that has been passed, signed by the president over the last 15 years is legislation that came out of the Senate with no House input whatsoever, none. You look at the Inflation Reduction Act last year. The House had no impact on that whatsoever. The Transportation Infrastructure Bill, the year before that this gang of, I don't know how many senators, 12 or 16 senators, Democrats, Republicans put together. The House passed the bill, the Senate just ignored it. And so that has happened over and over again, no matter who's in charge of the House. And as a member of the House, that was extremely frustrating. It just got worse and worse the time I was there. The Speaker has too much power. Members have given up, which I don't. It just baffles my mind. But part of it, I'm an independent thinker, and that was very frustrating to me. That I was expected to follow along the party line, and committees. There's still things that they work on. Congress in committees is supposed to be Congress at work, or at least it was. How many years ago? A century ago was that? But that's the way Congress is supposed to work. So I love being on the Transportation Committee and on the Science Committee, and we did some good work. It became less and less, even on those committees, became less and less bipartisan work. But it's bad for our system. It's not working the right way, and I think that's helping to add to the frustration a lot of people have.
So let's start. You're now a Hoover Fellow. I think Mo Fiorina, who's a longtime Hoover resident, has spent a lot of the last several decades arguing that polarization is purely an elite level phenomenon, that Congress is polarized, but that the public isn't. Do you think that's right? And maybe along with that, is this an elite driven? Is this driven by Congress, or is Congress responding to polarization in society?
Well, it brings me back to my days as an engineer in thinking about, and as a social scientist, thinking about where the impacts are. Is it elite driven? It is, in that the elites are determining what the choices are. And that's what was very frustrating in being in the House and feeling like, well, the Speaker has so much power, it's very difficult. By the time I get to have impact, it's all been, the bill's been put together already. And it's really run out of the Speaker's office. The interest groups have a lot of influence on that. Candidates, obviously party primaries determine who the Democrat, Republican are going to be, and as we know, they drive, Democrats more liberal, progressive. Further to the left come out of the primary, and same conservative on the Republican side. And so that is very problematic, but I struggle with, I think most people who I would talk to, in most of my constituents I talk to, would also be frustrated with the way things are. But they also, politicians are very good at pressing the right buttons, in getting people to hate the other side more than they hate their side. That's the way I see most elections is, if you're a Republican, you're trying to push people's buttons that, make them hate the Democrats more than they hate you. In the same way, go in the other direction. So, if everyone had a vote, if it wasn't predetermined who the candidates are, what the legislation is, yes, it would be more moderate. There would be more cooperation, but I think a lot of the problems is the leadership. So I generally do agree with that, but it's very complicated. Unfortunately, look, I had a problem when I was a politician. I never got away from being a political scientist and an engineer. It's like these issues are complex. There aren't simple solutions. It's funny, I was talking to a former colleague of mine a couple days ago, and he said, yeah, I was up there up in the House recently, and I was talking to one of our former colleagues, I won't say who it was, who said, on the campaign trail, every problem has a solution. Meaning, when you're out there campaigning, you're gonna tell people that every problem that they bring up to you, any problem they see, I have the solution for it. I could never bring myself to do that because I knew I didn't. But I think that frustrates people because they think, well, these problems are easily solved, and they're not, and they're complicated, and that's why we need to have both sides, everybody get together and really debate and be open-minded and willing to compromise.
So I know a number of political scientists, I think this is maybe also sort of an engineering perspective, would say the problem isn't the polarization, at least in society, or even amongst the elites. The problem is the institutions, and we should have you need an institutional fix. And at least a lot of the comparativists or Europeanists would say what we need is European institutions. We need proportional representation so that we have lots of parties and they have to compromise with each other to make a majority, get rid of the presidency, get rid of the Senate so there aren't so many obstacles, and then we can have polarization and things will work. What do you think of that? Is that a good engineering solution?
Well, my first answer is a very American answer is, look how good the Europeans do. I think the system that was set up in the Constitution was brilliant. I think that, and I think people have lost this, and people have no idea. I mean, we look at, even when we teach it about, well, how do we wind up with a House and a Senate, and how they were comprised. I mean, we talk about, well, it was compromises, big states, small states. But there's more to it than that. The idea that we had a very diverse country, which, again, people today would be like, diverse, in late 18th century America? Yeah, it was very diverse for the world at that time. They believed that writing this Constitution, people needed to feel, at least the voters, and not, obviously, the franchise was limited. I always have to add those caveats in case somebody is going to say something. The voters should want to feel like they have a chance. They have someone up there representing them, in speaking for them. And win or lose on a particular issue, they've been heard. And so you have a House, you have a Senate, you have two different places where you could potentially, you could be heard. The House and Senate members have to negotiate amongst themselves, and the House and Senate have to negotiate between them. And then you have the role for the president. I think that's a great system. It's worked for a long time. So I guess it's, well, there are some people who say, well, we need to change the system because it's not working now. I think we need a change in the way that Americans are dealing with politics and feel about politics and deal with each other is where the change, and that's a lot harder. It's admittedly a lot harder. But I don't think, first of all, we're not moving to a parliamentary system. It's not going to happen. And second, I don't think it would be a good idea.
I was going to say that sounds great to have us all get along and work together better, but how do we do that?
Leadership. We need I've just come to believe that we need some sort of social movement that, again, leads people to understanding that we all, if we want to keep our republic, and I wasn't even thinking about this, and it struck me at the end of listening to this podcast on my way up here. I was coincidentally listening to a podcast talking about the death of the Roman Republic. If we want to continue this country as a republic, we've got to figure out how we're going to get along. And no, there aren't easy answers. Better leadership from the elites is important. Fewer demagogue politicians. We've always had them. But also a sense that this country is, and I still really believe I'm not just talking as a politician, I believe this is the greatest country in the world, the greatest country in history of the world. I truly believe that. But it's up to us to continue to reform it, make it better, but it only happens if we work together and figure out how we can do that. One thing that someone had said to me a few months ago, read the Al Gore's concession speech in 2000. After the very contentious counting of the votes in Florida, I mean, if you don't remember, the presidential race between George W. Bush and Vice President Al Gore all came down to Florida. Whoever won Florida won the electoral votes. They'd be president. It couldn't have been any more. I mean, it was declared for Gore. Some media organizations declared for Gore, then for Bush, then for Gore, and then it's like, we don't know. Went on for, 35 days or so. What ballots count, what ballots don't count. And finally went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court comes out and rules. George Bush wins the presidency. Al Gore gave, and I don't think of Al Gore as a humble man. Let me just say that. But you read that concession speech, here's a man who he could have continued to argue that I'm president. He certainly wanted to be president. I mean, it was his life ambition to be president. And even in that speech, he says, I think, the policies that I wanted, I think were better for the country. He says all this, but he says, I don't agree with the Supreme Court. I accept their decision. For the good of the country, we need to move on. I congratulate George W. Bush, and it was just very much this whole sense of, especially today after what we went through a couple years ago, this idea that Al Gore saw the country in the long-term good of the country. He essentially said, the country is going to be worse off in the near term because it's going to be George Bush's policies and not mine. But the long term, I need to step back and congratulate George W. Bush, and we all need to get behind him and move forward. That's really remarkable. And I think every high school student should have to read that.
So I have the sense, and I think this fits with what you've said, that the leaders, in the next generation who are willing to do that sort of thing and willing to work with people on the other side are more and more getting pushed out of politics, more and more losing their primaries and so on. How do we get those leaders when that's happening? How do we get those to be the ones in politics rather than the ones who take advantage of not doing that?
Well, I saw a lot of good people lose or retire. It was very, I talked about sectarian partisanship. I was there for 16 years, from 2005 to 2021. There were 3 very different eras. My first 4 years is George W. Bush's second term. And despite all the turmoil over the Iraq War, there were things that when we took the House in the 2006 election, 2007, 2008, there were actually bipartisan accomplishments that got done. It was sort of, okay, everything that's going on and all the political battles over Iraq War were taking place, but there are other things we still worked on. Barack Obama gets elected. And Republicans really reacted against President Obama, but also because they were upset with George W. Bush. And I think the Republican Party, I don't know what the identity of the Republican Party is today. I still don't, the Republican Party doesn't know what its identity is, but they became very much, we are opposed to the Democrats. I mean, that's the thing. We're not the Democrats, we're opposed to the Democrats. In 2016, President Trump gets elected. I think Democrats turned the same way. Very much turned the same way. And I saw a lot of Republicans either lose, but a lot who retired from 2011 to 2016 because they just couldn't, they couldn't get anything done. You had the Freedom Caucus. That's another problem for the Republicans. And Republicans had the majority in the House then, but they didn't really have the majority. There were really Republican Party were two parties. So you need better leadership. You need something. I wish I had. It frustrates me so much. I think the solution is some kind of social movement that renews a civic patriotism that supports the self-evident truth of the Declaration of Independence and supports the idea that democracy requires debate, deliberation, and compromise. We have to come back to that kind of understanding. But do young people even hear that today? I don't even know. Are young people even exposed to that idea? I hear more of the majority has to rule. And again, it's hard as a politician to say no to that, but I think it's good that our system was set up so a majority doesn't automatically rule. But we need something has to change. And like I said, I wish I knew the solution, but I don't have it besides saying that. How do we change American society in that direction? And certainly I think social media is a big part of the problem. I think there's no question about that, but
so
go ahead.
Yeah, I want to bring faith into this a little, because I know you've written on this, but also, at least to me it seems, not causally tied in here, but related to this, that when I was younger, church felt more like a place where you meet people from different walks of life, you meet people with different political views, and it didn't fit in with that. And now, maybe the Catholic Church is closer to an exception to this, but so much, if you're evangelicals are Republicans, mainline Christians are Democrats, if you're an Orthodox Jew, maybe you're a Republican. If you're a Jew from another part of that faith, you're a Democrat. It feels very much, to me anyway, like that's been part of that polarization, and that's been part of that loss. Do you view those as connected, and do you think faith has a role to play in this, what you're talking about just now, of helping people come together and work with each other?
Well, first I tell a story, and I've written about this, and anyone could probably figure out who this is, but I've never said who it is, and I won't. So I'm talking to a former colleague of mine about a year ago who said, I used to call myself evangelical Protestant, and I don't anymore. I call myself I forget some kind of Christian. I forget what word he used to describe, descriptor.
Non-denominational, something like
yeah,
that.
something like non-denominational Protestant. He said that because he said, I've seen a lot of the evangelical churches have gotten to a point where politics comes first. Politics drives their faith. Even went so far as to say, some of them think Trump is Jesus. And I think that's incredibly problematic. As a person of faith, my bigger concern with that is people who have their politics drive their faith, and it's horrible for the country. So the book that I've been talking about writing for the last two and a half years, which I'm finally writing, I'm saying that, and I'm saying this now so everyone hears. People are asking me when the book's going to be finished for the last 2 years. I'm finally going to start it. But I sort of have, I write articles and my thinking changes slightly. But I'm arguing now what I said a few minutes ago, that we need a renewal of civic patriotism. And I think that Catholic social teaching is the best foundation for that, civic patriotism. And so the Catholic Church is certainly divided also, which is problematic, but it's still a place where you have, if you go through Catholic social teaching, it clearly doesn't fit into either party. And so it's still a place where hopefully people can, realizing that, rise above putting their politics first. And I'm not claiming all Catholics do this, but there are, because you have a set of principles in Catholic social teaching that are clear, not about what policy should be, but what you should be thinking about. Respect for the individual, respect for workers and the environment. And I think it gives people something to say, hey, these are things that we should be concerned about. And look, I don't see either party doing both of these, so maybe there's a different way, a better way to be thinking about these things.
So I've always been a fan of Roger Williams, the Rhode Island founder and early American figure, who sort of coined the metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state. But in his original formulation, it's a wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. And I think of that formulation, you see sort of his initial concern is keeping the wilderness out of the church. And indeed writes about, when the church has opened a gap in that wall, that God has torn down the wall and, let the wilderness take over the garden. How do we bring those values? How do we, be a Catholic or be a, Protestant or Muslim or whatever the faith is first, bring that to politics without that sort of backflow that Williams worries about happening? How do we bring that to our politics without our politics destroying the church in I think both the way he feared, but I think it relates to what we've talked about.
Well, that's something I think a lot of people miss is there was a lot, amongst many people at that time, there was a lot more concern about what was going to happen to the churches. It wasn't that the churches were going to have too much power over the government, it was the other direction, and it was going to dilute the churches. I mean, for an individual person of faith that they need to, it's the importance, as a Catholic, I've talked about being Catholic first, and understanding being Catholic first. That should come before anything else. But it reminds me of another issue which, there's a big, and I hate to get too Catholic now, into too many Catholic things, although we have a number of Catholics here. There are Catholics now who are arguing for, very vaguely arguing for more, something called Catholic integralism, that vaguely the Catholic Church has more power in the government because liberal democracy is failed. And I think that's extremely dangerous also. It's sort of problematic in some ways for me because a lot of people who I agree with on a lot of issues then sort of make this next step that liberal democracy has failed. I think the problem is people of faith should never look to the government to change society because they have failed to evangelize the society. I say if we see a problem in society, we need to evangelize the society better. We should look to ourselves first, not to the government to do this. It's not that there can't be better government policies from the perspective of a person of faith. But it's not, we should never look for the role of government to make people faithful. I understand people who feel this way. I understand their frustration with what they are seeing in our society, and I share that same frustration, but again, it's a common failure that people generally have, is to not look to themselves. And unfortunately, I think we do more and more of that today, as we look to the government to solve things that we need to look to ourselves. That doesn't really come out right, because it's not that I'm far from a libertarian. That's not what I mean. But I'll stop right there before I get in any more trouble.
Well, I think you've already kind of touched on this, but how do we find that line where we're bringing our faith to politics or our values to politics, but not imposing our faith on others? I think there's a lot of disagreement on where that line is, particularly on issues like abortion. What's your idea of how we know where to stop?
Well, if you're Catholic, you believe that there's such a thing as natural law that can be known through reason, that doesn't require faith. And to step in, I couldn't avoid it. I never tried to avoid it. The issue of abortion. I've always said to people, I am pro-life because I believe science shows us that life begins at conception and that life should be protected. Said I may have initially, when I was a kid, learned this in Catholic school, that I'm Catholic, so I'm supposed to be opposed to abortion, but I think that science shows us this is a human person, and that's why I believe that it should be protected. It's not because of my faith. And if you're Catholic, the Catholic Church is things that the Catholic Church supports when it comes to public policy come back to reason. And so I think, but it's something a lot of Catholics don't understand. I mean, I'm as a Catholic, I don't eat meat on Fridays during Lent, but I'm certainly not going to impose that on anybody else. I mean, that's an article of faith. It's nothing more than that. So that's sort of the, I think that's the answer there.
So shifting gears a little bit to be put my political science hat on. You've obviously spent plenty of time studying American politics. You know what's been written about Congress. There's a huge literature on polarization. What do we get wrong, if anything?
David Cannon. David Cannon here, who I actually didn't know this, that he was on the committee that let in grad students when I got into Duke. So I didn't realize David was. So I thank him for helping get me into Duke. So David, you You used to be the Congress guy, but I guess you've gotten away from that. I'm always asking, what do political scientists, what are they studying about Congress? Excuse me, now, and is there much being studied on Congress now, political scientists? I go back to the time when I was in, I get into trouble here, but only among political scientists. I was oftentimes frustrated. Well, first of all, the smartest people in the world that I've ever met were professors. And a lot of professors of political science, just incredibly intelligent, but they didn't, and the discipline didn't reward actually understanding what was going on in politics, which is unfortunate. And they could, some incredible mathematical models, some incredible rational choice theories that then abstracted so far from the reality that you can learn something, but you don't forget that first page said that this is an abstraction. So I can't. It's hard for me to really answer that. But it's hard. But in defense of political scientists, I run into this all the time now because I still think like an academic, and I want to explain things, and I know way too much about Congress that I know what all the exceptions are, and it's hard to really generalize.
Right, well, I was going to say, was there ever a time in Congress where you're like, oh, I was taught things worked this way, but
no.
But now that I'm here, they don't. Yeah.
No, because I'm not really sure what they taught me, how Congress worked. And Dick Fenno was still the greatest book ever. My favorite book on American politics, Home Styles, about how members of Congress follow members of Congress around. This is how they, different ways that they relate to their constituents, and they build trust. And that's still the most important, that's still the best political science book. That idea of building trust is what politicians need to do with their constituents and for people elected. And that still comes through as no question.
Do you ever regret or going into politics or wish you had stayed in political science?
I can't change it, so I don't like looking back with regret. No, for all the trouble, it's very rewarding to feel like you're helping people. And even when Congress isn't working very well, the lawmaking process isn't working very well, to feel like there are individuals that I could help. Or there were, look, I was able to pass, and it depends on how you count, 16, 18, I try to count up 20 bills. And they all did something important. They weren't really big, but I think they all did something important. And I always said there will never be a job nearly as interesting as being a member of Congress, because it was different every day. I looked at it as, again, this is going back to my engineering and my political science in my Duke graduate school. I looked at it every day as you have all these different games, and they're interconnected games that in different people that I needed to, whether it's, you have to be, you're looking at getting reelected, you're looking at getting legislation through Congress. I mean, there's so many different things you're trying to do, and then so many people in each of those that you need to work with and figure out how's this all going to work. It was just fascinating to work, to sort of be in that and be working through that all the time. And I felt like I was doing some good. And I always go back to, so my father was an alderman in Chicago City Council for 7 years. Then he ran for Congress, was in Congress for 22 years. Very different background than me. He's hopefully watching. He went to Loras College for 2 semesters, and I think he went to play basketball. That didn't work. He came back home. He started working for the Chicago Park District as a physical education instructor. He worked his way up the old-fashioned way in politics, got known in the community, part of, joining the Chicago Democratic machine. But he always looked at politics as you're in politics, you're in elective office to help people. And that's always the way I saw it. You're there to help people. That's the bottom line. And I felt like I was able to do that. And so I don't regret going into it. It just got a whole lot more difficult near in the last few years, not just electorally difficult, but just the process just had broken down. Legislative process had broken down so much. It became a lot more frustrating, but it was still, it was an honor to be able to serve. And I thought about running again. I considered running again last year as an independent because I said I don't have a great desire to go back to the House, but I feel there's something really wrong, and I need to be part of trying to fix it. But I'm not going back. I'm not running as a Democrat. I'm not running as a Republican. I said I don't want Nancy Pelosi or Kevin McCarthy telling me what to do. I decided not to go that route and run as an independent. I mean, things are really stacked against doing that. But I still hope to make a difference.
So I have a lot more questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask anybody. So if anybody has questions, please go ahead. Yeah, could you, I think, step over to the mic so the live streaming audience can hear?
Sure. And then you can just pass it around.
Do you think maybe having term limits on serving in the House of Representatives and Congress or Senate would actually help, change or move things along? Because, sometimes I feel there's too many elected officials out there. They're way too long.
I think there are a lot of elected officials who are there way too long, but I don't support term limits. I think the problem with term limits, there's a number of problems. I think you learn a lot more the longer you're there. If you're doing a good job, if you're really trying, you learn things about issues. You learn how to try to get things done, and it takes a number of years to do that. Staff will have more power if members are there a shorter amount of time. If there's more turnover, staff stay there longer. Especially committee staff. Committee staff have a tremendous amount of power because they stay there for a long time and they are very knowledgeable. And I, at times, had trouble with committee staff who thought that they were more important, and a lot of times they're able to work the system to, squash things that I had an agreement with another member on.
Or should there be more on-the-job training? Because I understand it would be very complicated.
Yes. I'm not sure exactly what that would be.
How about more staffing? I think is another thing.
It was terrible that when the House kept cutting its staff. I mean, that was horrible. Just because you need people who are gonna. Again, some members hire staff for good reasons, and others don't. But you've got to have. The good staff is just so incredibly important, and you got to get good people. I always had so I was on the, like I said, Science, Space, and Technology Committee. I always had my staff who were on there was a PhD in physics, then a PhD in physics, then a PhD in chemistry. People who like really knew, and so they could actually explain things to me. And that was so incredibly helpful, but those, they were giving up doing other things for a while in order to be able to do that. Interest groups will also have more power if there's term limits. Now, I believe in term limits on leaders. I think Speaker of the House should have a term limit. I like the House Republicans have a rule that you can only be the top Republican on a committee for 6 years, and then you're out. You can't be that. I think that's a good idea also. I think if you are in a more executive position, that is good to have turnover there. And so I would support term limits for those types of positions in Congress, but not for all members of Congress, even though I agree there's too many people who stay there for too long. But their constituents keep putting them back there.
So I want to go back to your point about teaching our students about the importance of compromise, and just let you know that that is the theme of my Introduction to American Politics class that I teach to 350 students every year. I hit them over the head with, you can't have a democratic form of government without compromise. And it's something they need to hear, and they aren't terribly receptive to it, but hopefully it sinks in a little bit. So my question is, though, about something we were talking about at the table before the event started, which is cross-party friendships in Congress and how that seems to have disappeared. I had the honor of moderating an event a little while ago here on campus between Jim Sensenbrenner and Dave Obey. They had this tour they did around the state where they went to a lot of towns and college campuses around the state to talk about the importance of exactly what you're talking about, the importance of compromise and working together across the partisan aisle. And my sense is, looking at Congress from the outside, that just doesn't happen anymore, the friendships across the aisle. And when did that change? Did it change like during your tenure? And is there any way to go back to that, do you think? Because I think that would help a lot in terms of accomplishing what's missing right now, which is that kind of bipartisanship.
I think it certainly went down during my time there. I'm not sure if it's, well, first of all, just to be clear so people understand, there are very few opportunities that you have to, be together with members of the other party, because most meetings that you're in, your Democratic caucus, Republican conference, they have their meetings. Even in hearings or committee work, okay, you have both Democrats and Republicans there, but they both sit, they sit on opposite sides of the dais. A funny story about one of my first year there. There's a Republican who I got to know him during new member orientation. So first, I was on the small business committee, first committee hearing. Come in, I sit down. I know on the Democratic side. He comes and he sits. This is a Republican. He comes, sits next to me. And a Republican staffer comes over to him, committee staffer tells him, please move over there to the Republican side. And first he said, no, I'm fine here. And then the staffer said, no, you need to move over to the other. So there aren't that many opportunities, and I think they've gotten fewer. It was, I don't think it's never been as bad as it looks from the outside. But I think more time also has been members have gotten more busy. And so that's even less time, that's sort of free time, sort of social time. But look, I I got to know more Republicans through events that were Catholic events. The house side Catholic church, the pastor started having these dinners for members. And 10, 15 of us would show up, and that would be an opportunity. But there weren't that many chances to get together like that. So yes, it got worse, but my understanding is after January 6th, it's gotten much worse. That after that, it became, absolutely toxic. And Democrats who refused to co-sponsor a bill that anyone who didn't, who voted against certifying any of the states, right? Won't even co-sponsor if their names. But that just shows how toxic it got. And then when the metal detectors were put in the House floor, Republicans really got upset at that, which I thought was I didn't quite understand why are they so upset about putting them. They put the metal detectors to walk on the House floor until I actually went there. Because as a former member, as long as you're not a lobbyist, and I'm not a lobbyist, you can have access to the House floor. And it was just really odd walking through a metal detector to get on the House floor. It was just, so I kind of more understood why that sort of upset them so much. I thought it was kind of ridiculous that I didn't think anyone's going to bring a gun to the floor and shoot another member. But I think it just got a lot worse the last 2 years, is my understanding. I don't know how it gets better. Somehow there has to be more efforts made by outside organizations to bring members together. But you talking about David Obey. David Obey was, old school liberal, very liberal. But I mean, he very strong in his views, his ideology, but he got along with people.
I think you can hear me. I don't know if I want to talk about friendship or civility, which the former questioner sort of brought you into this. Getting into, if you have friendships, I mean, if you spend time with someone, you're usually civil to someone sitting next to you. Except there are exceptions. So the bringing together of people so that they can talk to one another, so it's a civil kind of a conversation. And the other night I was watching Tony Evers. He was doing his budget address, and I was really kind of embarrassed because I'm a Republican, and Tony Evers could say anything like, every child deserves a good education. Okay? All the Republicans were just sitting there like, ooh. And the Democrats were up, they were like, we agree with that. Who doesn't agree with something like that? But when did it get to the point where it's almost group speak? Not one person in that whole Republican side of where they were sitting had the balls to stand up and say, yeah, I think every child needs a good education. I mean, what's to disagree with that? But why is it this group speak that where is it written? And I was writing a letter to the editor, but I didn't know who to write it to. Like, where did this come from? And it would have been the same, if there had been a Republican, if Tommy Thompson had been standing up there, there would have even been some Democrats who wouldn't stand up for him. I can't believe it, but anyway, how did this, it's just in the 50 years or so that I've been in politics and following it and so on, it didn't used to be that way. I mean, am I just seeing things or not seeing things correctly? It just seems that the last 5 or 10 years we've been going into this, okay, everybody has to have their script, and you sit down if you're a Republican, and you can stand up if you're a Democrat. I mean, have any of you experienced that or seen that, or is it just me?
Oh, no, you're exactly right. Well, first thing, I always said, I hated the State of the Union address. I hated going to it because I just didn't like having to stand up and sit down so many times. But it's interesting, if you're there on the House floor, certain issues, you could see members looking around to see, is this something we stand for, or can we? It's the whole, I call sectarian partisanship. It is in-group, out-group behavior, and people are afraid, members of Congress, members of the state legislature are afraid for their group to see them doing something wrong, like standing up and cheering for something that the other side says. But that was always the most interesting. There's certain things where you can, if you're on the floor, you could see members looking to each other, like if there's something a Democratic president said, and there'd be Republicans who agree with it, but they're like, I don't want to be the only Republican to stand up now and clap. So yeah, I mean, it's really sad. Now, what I've been mentioning this all day, the Problem Solvers Caucus, group of Democrats and Republicans in the House who got together. It really got going stronger in 2017. It was the most enjoyable, some of that was the most enjoyable time I had. We got together every week. So you couldn't just join, you had to be let into it, the group. So there was some trying to keep members out who are just going to claim that they want to work together. So the idea is for Democrats and Republicans to work together. So we'd meet every week. We'd talk about issues that maybe we could work together on. There are a couple of issues where we came up with legislation. One was on, it's in 2017, 2018. One was on health care. And the other one was on immigration. And the most amazing thing, immigration is such a hot button issue. In my district, even back in 2005, immigration was always the most hot button issue. I mean, there would be almost fights that broke out in my town hall meetings, people on both sides of the issue. You see, it's so hard to do anything in Congress on that. But we actually had Democrats and Republican members sit down and say, okay, what can you, it was when President Trump said, okay, I'm going to get rid of DACA, the Deferred Action, what's this? Childhood arrivals. So for those who came here younger than 18 generally, and so it was like, okay, so who exactly was included in DACA? Okay, who's in the DREAM Act that was a bill that would create a path to citizenship? Okay, and Democrats and Republicans, we met. We had these meetings starting at 9 p.m. because everyone was so busy. It was like, okay, when can we actually meet? And we'd meet at 9 p.m., and I would sometimes have to run out to catch the last metro train so I can get to my apartment, which was not on Capitol Hill. But we actually sat down and went through what I always thought Congress is supposed to be like. All right, what do you need? What can you live with? What can't you live with? And being willing to compromise to come up with something. Of course, we came up with something, and then there's just no way to bring it to the House floor. And the speaker, I mean, at that time it was Paul Ryan, but no speaker would have allowed a bipartisan group of rank and file members to bring something like that to the floor. Senators can do that. In the House, the rules are just so that there's still some members who try to do it. There's fewer and fewer because they either get defeated in primaries or they just say, forget it, I've had enough.
So let me follow up briefly on that. Say, how much of this is sort of technology driven, like there's the cameras that are on and you're concerned about, this going viral, it's social media and everything, and it'd be different if, the cameras were off and this was behind closed doors?
Well, that reminds me of a story of 2017 probably. It's like December 2017. I was invited to the White House for a screening of Darkest Hour, I think was the movie. And so this is in the family theater at the White House. And I'm like, do I go? Do I not go? I'm like, I'm going. I mean, when do I have an opportunity? But it's Donald Trump, president. So I go, and it's about 40 members, about 10 senators, 30 House members, maybe something like that, maybe a little smaller. There were a few Democrats who were there, and it was very interesting to be in that room. Afterwards, Donald Trump gets up. And he says, who wants to see the Lincoln bedroom? And I would say Donald Trump was exactly the way, in person, was exactly the way that you see him on TV. Almost like a caricature. So he goes and takes us upstairs, and it was the Christmas displays were up and everything. We go in the Lincoln bedroom. And while we're there, Senator Joe Manchin is there. So Joe Manchin wants a picture of him with President Trump because it's popular. Even though he's a Democrat, it's West Virginia. So he has someone take a picture of him shaking hands with Donald Trump. And the next day, he sends that out. The staff sends that out. Well, in the background of that picture is me talking to Paul Ryan. And immediately, it starts going around social media about Lipinski's partying with Donald Trump at the White House. Look, he really is Donald Trump's favorite Democrat. He loves Donald Trump. He was there celebrating passage of the tax bill, which I voted against. And it was a few days before I think the tax bill actually passed. But because I was there in the background and because I was talking to Paul Ryan, the interesting thing, Paul Ryan, me and Paul both have smiles on our faces. Paul Ryan's telling me this is the second time I've been in the Lincoln bedroom. He said the first time was when I was first elected in 1998. Bill Clinton didn't know who was going to be voting on impeachment. Would it be the current House or the new House? So Bill Clinton, being a great politician, invites all the new members of Congress to the White House, gives them the tour, and Paul Ryan says, that's the first time I was in the Lincoln bedroom, and this is the second time I'm there, which I thought was a great story. It says a lot about, makes sense. Bill Clinton's like covering all the bases there. I got to make sure. But that picture wound up in a political ad against me because I was there at the White House. In the same picture with Donald Trump. I wasn't even with Donald Trump. I was with an evil Republican, though. So that kind of stuff, I don't know how you got me onto this, but I think you're talking about social media and things going around. That's what happens, and that's just, yeah. It was a good movie. I was just most interested beforehand. I was like, how is Donald Trump going to act during a movie? I can't imagine. I was like, what's Donald Trump going to be like? Can he actually sit there quiet during the movie?
Did he?
At the beginning of the movie, they're showing their opening credits, and they're showing the manufacturing of planes, I think, and tanks, and Donald Trump exclaimed something about, in reaction to, I don't even know what it was, but it was sort of something I would expect Donald Trump to exclaim, seeing these pictures of this. But then he didn't say anything the rest of the, but someone who was sitting next to him said, yeah, he was on his phone the whole time. I couldn't see, I was in the back, he was in the front. But the senator told me, yeah, Trump was on the phone the whole time.
I too was raised a Catholic. I'm probably a John the 23rd kind of Catholic, probably to the left of some of the people here. I struggle with the idea of a personal self and a public self in government and what a politician should be. And I've listened to what you've had to say here, and I'm concerned that one of the problems we have now is too many people in Congress, too many people in the Senate and the House of Representatives who are interested in their particular personal or religious beliefs and applying them to other people. And I guess what I would ask you is, what's the proper role of a public representative to represent the people in the district, regardless of whether they're Jewish or Islamic or Protestant or Catholic, or to faithfully represent and reproduce their own beliefs? When I look at the Catholic Church in American society today, I don't think they have any place to say they're underrepresented. The court is dominated by Catholics at the Supreme Court level, and we see it in the policies they're applying. The point of it is, I guess, I, as probably a fallen away Catholic, feel that my views are not respected and not represented in government. And I'm concerned about that. I'm concerned that we've lost the ability to respect other people's beliefs in this democracy. So that's generally my question. What's the role of a representative, personal or public self?
Well, a candidate runs and they say what they believe and what they're going to support. Generally, I think that, I always thought that I should represent my constituents. There were very few times where I thought that my personal views were really different from my constituents. But I also looked at my constituents being all of my constituents, not just the Democrats, which is something that I probably was a little out of line with the Democratic primary voters, a little bit, and why I wound up losing. But I looked at all my constituents, and I tried best to represent them. But I didn't hide what I supported and who I am and what I supported when it came to public policy. That's the way I look at it.
I just want to echo and thank you for promoting Catholic social teaching as a possibility for a range. Yeah. I'll try to speak a little bit louder. I just wanted to thank you for proposing Catholic social teaching. I think that it is a beautiful way to look at politics. And I wanted to, ask a couple-part question. First of all, I don't think we've said this yet, but sometimes you're given the label of the last pro-life Democrat in Congress. Whether or not that remains to be seen. But I want to ask specifically, what do you think are the possibilities for bipartisan work in supporting women and children in our country, within our states? You've been kind of at an interesting inflection point in that area. So any thoughts you have, whether it's within politics or movements without, that might create some movement to protect families?
Thank you. We should have you answering a lot of these questions, since you have to deal with these things on the state level as with the Catholic Conference. But I'm glad you brought that up. I don't know if anyone saw, I had a piece in America magazine talking about I think because it's the right thing to do and because it's politically good, that the pro-life movement needs to break away from this marriage to libertarianism and support policies that are going to help pregnant women and families with with children. And there has been some movement in that direction. There have been Republicans who have proposed legislation like that. Marco Rubio had some good bill that I think was pretty good. There's a idea that was just put out there recently that childbirth should be free. And this was written by the head of Democrats for Life and also someone at Americans United for Life, which surprised me a little bit. I was always very frustrated that a lot of the pro-life organizations were too closely tied to the Republican Party. So I'm hopeful now that maybe there is going to be some movement in that direction that you're talking about. However it's done, whether it's a new programs, whether it's tax credits, whatever, helping organizations that help women and children. But I think I'm hoping there's some possibilities there for that. Unfortunately, it's now that kind of support gets tied to being pro-life or anti-abortion, and then you have Democrats who are afraid to embrace it. There was a program that was in the Affordable Care Act that was provided funding for programs to help pregnant college women who were, I think, victims of domestic violence or sexual assault, and also help other women in similar situations. So there was this program, it's included in the Affordable Care Act. It lasted 10 years, it ran out because no Republican picked it up to push it, and Democrats, I think, were afraid that this is associated with being pro-life. And so no Democrat picked it up. Again, I'm hopeful that there is movement there. It's something that pro-life Democrats always supported, is doing more, because being a Democrat, I see a greater role for the government. Not for big government, but as I said earlier, I'm not a libertarian. So I think I'm hopeful there's a possibility. I think it's going to depend on a Republican presidential candidate picking it up. I think that's going to be very important for something like that.
I think I need to adjust this. So I know we talked a little bit earlier, also Catholic, though that was not the nature of my question. I was thinking something that hasn't really been mentioned here thus far, but it kind of ties into you mentioning maybe running as an independent or thinking about that, is the kind of, I guess I should preface this by saying I'm part of a nonpartisan reform effort here in the state. We're mostly focused on Final Five voting right now, but we kind of pivot to whatever issues seem to have some potential to actually succeed in getting passed. So from your perspective, as someone who's actually run for election numerous times and won, and then also had to deal with very partisan primary and just all the different things you've seen over the years, which of the nonpartisan reform efforts, I guess, that you're familiar with seem to have the most, plausible, best probability of succeeding, maybe not only electorally, like getting passed by, let's say in Wisconsin, perhaps, but also likely making a difference in the long run based on what you know from experience. I'm very interested to hear your perspective. Thanks.
Well, after I had talked about running as an independent, I had a number of groups reach out to me who were trying to do various election reforms, changing the system. Alaska uses ranked choice voting where you have to rank. Maine uses it too. Alaska just started it. It sunk Sarah Palin. who is running for Congress. Alaska elected their first Democratic representative ever, or did they have one before? But it was because Sarah Palin would have won if it was, just everybody. But there are a lot of Republicans who didn't preferred the Democrat to Sarah Palin, and they wanted with the two. They wanted with two. Is ranked choice voting? Yeah, and so they ranked her lower. I think ranked choice voting is a little too complicated. Someone came to me and said, "What about preference voting?" Which I had not. I hate to say this as a political scientist, wasn't really aware of preference voting, where essentially it's you go and everyone's on the ballot. You don't have Democrat, Republican primaries. Everyone who qualifies is on the ballot, and then you go in to vote, and you vote for as many as you want in that list. And whoever gets the most votes, you can vote for one person. If there's 10, you can vote for one. You could vote for 5. You could vote for all 10 and wouldn't really make any difference.
Would it be superior to ranked choice for any reason? Is there any rational reason why it's superior?
I think it's simpler because because if you had 10 candidates or even 5 candidates, like, do I really know who's 1, who's 2, who's 3, who's 4, who's 5? And that I think it gets more confusing. I think that, so, anything that changes the primary system we have now, I think could be good for, who we get as representatives or whatever office it is.
I was going to say, don't quote me on the exact number, but I think they polled Alaskans after this last election. I think roughly 75–80% actually found ranked choice voting to be easy. Because I think
Good.
the way that there was a lot of campaigning ahead of it to explain to voters, but I think that the bottom line that came out of it was people knew enough that they, on average, found Palin to be offensive.
Right.
And even people on both sides found the current representative, she's very likable. And so the nature of the ranked choice voting concept, I guess, or any system like that is it favors people who tend to be nice and tend to actually, it goes back to what you're talking about, trust and relationship, I think.
I mean, just to offer the other side on this, so this is here, I think it's not clear in Alaska is that this outcome is any different than if it had been primaries and a two-candidate general election, because, Sarah Palin lost to the Democrat, and that seems like the same outcome that would have happened if those had been the only two candidates. The thing that you would want, if you want a centrist thing, is for the other Republican candidate, who was at least arguably more moderate than Sarah Palin and would be in the middle of the three, to have won. And I think that is the claim that people who support preference or approval voting make, that that's the one, if you have a situation with, say 40% on the left, 40% on the right, and 20% in the middle, that would be the one that let the 20%, but that's, give you the candidate in the middle, whereas ranked choice voting would eliminate that. So I don't mean to, to argue on the claim, but I just want to offer the other.
Don't we have an
perspective
elections
here.
expert right here? David, what's the solution?
Well, it depends on what the goal is, but I think it's right, the approval voting is more likely to elect the centrist. But ranked choice voting, I think, does also make extremes be less likely to win. The less likable candidate is going to be ranked last, by people who then, if you have a close race, it's more likely to drop that person out too. So I mean, they both can have the effect of eliminating the most extreme person, but I think Alex is right that the approval voting is more likely. If you're in the 40-40-20 situation, ranked choice voting won't get that 20 in the middle. So it kind of depends on what the alignment is.
And I think there's an empirical question here of would the more moderate Republicans in this, basically, whose first choice was it Begich? Again, trying to blank out of the moderate Republican candidate in this race, or more centrist one, who ranked Democrat above Palin, would they have voted that same way if it had been just those two candidates on the ballot? Or are there people who, because they get to rank their first choice who's going to lose, are willing to rank the Democrat but wouldn't do that in the second round? And like empirically, I don't know the answer. If people are just voting their preferences, that they would expect that, you know, the people who ranked Pelota above Palin would have done the same thing if those had been the only two candidates, then the advantages on this are sort of unclear, if or possibly non-existent. But there is an argument that maybe actually people behave differently, that getting to express that my first choice is a moderate Republican changes behavior. But I haven't seen studies on that sort of empirical claim. Yes, David, please.
Could I sort of change the subject a little bit here?
Absolutely.
I was shocked to read an article by Seymour Hersh last week about the bombing of the Russian pipelines that went into Germany. I sort of agreed with the president, but I was shocked that someone would spell out all the details, because I think it could have disastrous consequences. What's your view?
You know, now, as soon as you started talking about that, again, it's another one of those, oh, I started reading that article and I never really finished it. I wish I would have now for this question, but I guess the question doesn't specifically have to rely on me having read it. You're talking about the idea that this information is actually out there, that someone talked about.
Yes.
I completely agree. If this did happen, why is anyone who knows about it talking about it? I know there's been, I forget who it was now, who came out and said that the United States has, there are U.S. military advisors on the ground in Ukraine. And I had a number of people say to me that it's horrible that someone comes out and says that. I don't have a problem with it, but it's terrible. It just should not come out. But, you know, it's always, you know, it's always it's so tough. I probably may side more with keeping things like that quiet, but then there's all kinds of issues with, you know, you can't, when you stop talking about everything, then some bad things happen that shouldn't happen, and the government does things that shouldn't happen. So I always hate staking out the position, but on this I agree. It's like, what good is that story being out there? But I think that's just the way things are today.
To follow up on this, I mean, you know, there's obviously the accuracy. This report has been disputed, but part of the claim is that the relevant congressional committees weren't informed. Well, they normally should have for this sort of thing. Does that, first of all, strike you as plausible, and second of all, would that be concerning? If so?
I'm really torn, because I complain a lot about Congress does not fulfill its role Congress does not defend itself as an institution, and lets the president do so many things because partisanship comes first. And Congress just generally has become lazy about these things. It doesn't defend itself as an institution. I think that's terrible for the country. And so I think when an administration does not inform Congress about things, that is bad. They have a responsibility. On the other hand, I know how much of a sieve Congress is, and I don't trust a lot of those people. Members aren't going to come out and say something, but I would still go to the side of Congress should be informed about things like that. Now, when I was a member of Congress, we'd have these briefings where we'd walk into the secure, once they built the visitor center, They had a big auditorium that was secure, that supposedly couldn't be listened into from the outside. So all members of Congress have to walk there. We have to leave all our electronic devices outside this room. We go in this room, we get this briefing on something that was going on, something that happened. I never heard one thing in any of those briefings that I didn't read in the newspaper previous to that. And so people used to always think that, oh, you're a member of Congress, and I guess I'm supposed to pretend like I got all this secret information. There were times where I was able to go into a secure room and review documents if I requested to, and I did do that. But I think that administrations, I mean, through the years, and it's just gotten worse, have found that Congress is terrible for leaks. And I think that's awful that Congress does that, but I still think that Congress should still be informed.
If I could just follow up a little bit. If the United States can bomb 2 pipelines at the cost of, I think, probably billions of dollars to the Russians, isn't it possible that they will try to do something to us? And if so, what do we need to do to prepare for that?
I would think that they would try to do something like that, and I don't know how we prepare for that, but I hope somebody does know how we prepare to prevent something like that.
Yeah, one last question.
Hi, thanks so much. Given the disastrous and distasteful effects of the stranglehold that the 2 parties have not only on the electoral system in this country, but also the functioning of our democracy as you laid out for us today, what do you see as the best path forward? You mentioned possibly running as an independent. There are many hurdles and obstacles for that to be a realistic path. What do you see as the path forward for our democracy to overcome these seemingly insurmountable obstacles?
I wish I had the answer.
It'll be in your book, right?
It'll be in my book. Well, there's one thing that I think has been, I think the state of the Republican Party, and I'm not saying this as a partisan, I think the state of the Republican Party hurts American politics. Because the Republican Party, I think, sort of is, I don't know what it is. I don't think Republicans know what it is. And it really is going to be dependent on the next Republican presidential candidate. I've said this back a decade ago. I think it would be good for our political system for the Republican Party to be a party that is more sort of together in a vision, in a forward vision, because then that would force the Democrats also to do more of that. I think it's been harmful to the system what's going on with the where the Republican Party is today. And again, I don't say that just because I'm being against the Republicans, but I think it's gonna take a change in. We get elites. Yes, elites lead. We need better leadership from elites in this country. But Americans also have to demand better. And I think we need to make sure we teach young people. And David, I'm glad to hear you say that, because I think that young people today don't often get that message. About the need for getting along with people and for compromise. I don't see how anyone lives there. I mean, a lot of these politicians who refuse to compromise, I don't understand how they live everyday life with other people. because we all know we need to compromise in any kind of relationship that we have. And I think it's the same for politics. I also think it troubles me that I think there needs to be more healthy patriotism in belief in America, in belief in institutions, and the need to reform institutions. Institutions constantly need to be reformed, but just tearing down institutions is disastrous. It's absolutely disastrous. It's done on both the left and the right. And that is something that I think we need to, again, we should be, America's about ideas. Okay? Anyone can be an American if they agree to these ideals, and that's what's, I hate to say this because I start sounding so cliched, but that's what's made America great. And that's why people want to come here to this country. And we need to continue to promote these ideas and ideals, admit when we've failed, but I still think, again, we need to go back and look at, and I was, something in the last few days reminded me of, and I read through Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And the whole idea of looking back and saying it was a promissory note. The Declaration of Independence was a promissory note. And after all those years, Black Americans were saying we finally are owed this as Americans. And I think that is so much more constructive. And looking back at the Civil Rights Movement, how much more constructive that was, and how important it was, and we don't see that in. We have too many movements today that are just about tearing down and not building. We need to do more to build. And again, it's hard, but we need to be dedicated to that, and we need to keep teaching, especially young people, that idea. That without these institutions, even when they're faulty, we have nothing. And it really bothers me that people don't understand that. They don't understand what we all have been given. And it's our responsibility to keep building and making better. And I've always believed that, and my experiences in politics have only made me feel more strongly that way. But it's something I grew up, it's something I learned growing up. And I just still believe that no matter how bad things look, I think we have to keep figuring out how we're gonna build. But it's up to everybody.
All right. I think this is a great question to end on. I do want to add that in addition to David's class, I think part of the mission of our Thompson Center, and indeed events like this, is to help facilitate that understanding and dialogue, and especially to bring that to campus. And I hope that this has been a small part of that as well. I want to thank Congressman Lipinski for joining us and having this wonderful conversation with us.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.